Hello my dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and tonight we're going to continue to read Emily of New Moon. If you're just stumbling across this video now, I've got a whole playlist on my channel of the first 3 chapters. We're starting now with chapter 4. I'm reading this book off of the Project Gutenberg website, which is a website where they archive books once they reach a certain age and become public domain, and you can kind of do what you want with them, which is how I'm able to read this one to you now. So without too much more fanfare, let's get on into it. Chapter 4 is called A Family Conclave. Emily wakened at daylight the next morning. Through her low, uncurtained window, the splendor of the sunrise was coming in, and one faint white star was still lingering in the crystal green sky over the rooster pine. A fresh, sweet wind of dawn was blowing around the eaves. Ellen Green was sleeping in the big bed and snoring soundly, except for that, the little house was very still. It was the chance for which Emily had waited. Very carefully, she slipped from her bed, tiptoed across the room, and opened the door. Mike uncoiled himself from the mat on the middle of the floor and followed her, rubbing his warm sides against her chilly little ankles. Almost guiltily, she crept down the bare, dark staircase. How the steps creaked! Surely it would waken everybody, but nobody appeared. And Emily got down and slipped into the parlor, drawing a long breath of relief as she closed the door. She almost ran across the room to the other door. Aunt Ruth's floral pillow still covered the glass of the casket. Emily, with a tightening of the lips that gave her face an odd resemblance to Aunt Elizabeth, lifted up the pillow and set it on the floor. "Oh, Father, Father," she whispered, putting her hand to her throat to keep something down. She stood there, a little shivering white-clad figure, and looked at her father. This was to be her goodbye. She must say it when they were alone together. She would not say it before the Murrays. Father looked so beautiful. All the lines of pain had vanished, and his face looked almost like a boy's, except for the silver hair above it. And he was smiling. Such a nice, whimsical, wise little smile, as if he had suddenly discovered something lovely and unexpected and surprising. She had seen many nice smiles on his face in life, but never one just like this. "Father, I didn't cry before then," she whispered. "I'm sure I didn't disgrace the stars. Not shaking hands with Aunt Ruth wasn't disgracing the stars, was it? Because she didn't really want me to. Oh, Father, I don't think any of them like me, unless perhaps Aunt Laura does a little. And I'm going to cry a little bit now, Father, because I can't keep it back all the time." She laid her face on the cold glass and sobbed bitterly but briefly. She must say goodbye before anyone found her raising her head and looking long and earnestly at the beloved face. "Goodbye, dearest darling," she whispered chokingly. Dashing away her blinding tears, she replaced Aunt Ruth's pillow, hiding her father's face from her forever. Then she slipped out, intent on speedily regaining her room. At the door, she almost fell over Cousin Jimmy, who was sitting on a chair before it, swathed in a huge, checked dressing gown and nursing Mike. "Shh," he whispered, patting her on the shoulder. "I heard you coming down and followed you. I knew what you wanted. I've been sitting here to keep them out if any of them came after you. Here, take this and hurry back to your bed." This was a roll of peppermint lozenges. Emily clutched it and fled, overcome with shame at being seen by Cousin Jimmy in her nightgown. She hated peppermints and never ate them, but the fact of Cousin Jimmy Murray's kindness in giving them to her sent a thrill of delight to her heart. She liked that. She had thought nobody would ever call her nice pet names again or be nice to her. Father had said so many of them for her: sweetheart and darling and Emily child and dear wee kidlet and honey and elfkin. He had a pet name for every mood, and she had loved them all. As for Cousin Jimmy, he was nice. Whatever part of him was missing, it wasn't his heart. She felt so grateful to him that after she was safely in her bed, she forced herself to eat one of the lozenges, though it took all of her grit to worry it down. The funeral was held that forenoon. For once, the lonesome little house in the hollow was filled. The coffin was taken into the parlor, and the Murrays as mourners sat stiffly and deconsciously all around it. Emily among them, pale and prim in her black dress. She sat between Aunt Elizabeth and Uncle Wallace and dared not move a muscle. No other star was present. Her father had no near living relatives. The Maywood people came and looked at his dead face with a freedom and insolent curiosity that they never would have presumed on in life. Emily hated to have them looking at her father like that. They had no right. They hadn't been friendly to him while he was alive. They'd said harsh things of him. Ellen Green had sometimes repeated them. Every glance that fell on him hurt Emily, but she sat still and gave no outward sign. Aunt Ruth said afterwards that she had never seen a child so absolutely devoid of all natural feeling. When the service was over, the Murrays rose and marched around the coffin for a dutiful look of farewell. Aunt Elizabeth took Emily's hand and tried to drag her along with them, but Emily pulled it back and shook her head. She had said her goodbye already. Aunt Elizabeth seemed for a moment to be on the point of insisting, but then she grimly swept onward alone, looking every inch a Murray. No scene must be made at a funeral. Douglas Starr was to be taken to Charlottetown for the burial beside his wife. The Murrays were all going, but Elizabeth was not to go. But Emily was not to go. She watched the funeral procession as it wound up the long grassy hill, through the gray light rain that was beginning to fall. Emily was glad it was raining. Many a time she had heard Ellen Green say that happy was the corpse the rain fell on. And it was easier to see Father go away in that soft, kind gray mist than through sparkling, laughing sunshine. Well, I must say the funeral went off fine, said Ellen Green at her shoulder. Everything's been done regardless. If your father was looking down from heaven at it, Emily, I'm sure he'd be pleased. He isn't in heaven, said Emily. Good gracious. Of all the children, Ellen could say no more. He isn't there yet. He's only on the way. He said he'd wait around and go slow until I died too, so that I could catch up with him. I hope I die soon. That's a wicked thing to wish, said Ellen. When the last buggy had disappeared, Emily went back to the sitting room, got a book out of the bookcase, and buried herself in the wing chair. The women who were tidying up were glad she was quiet and out of the way. It's well she can read, said Mrs. Hubbard gloomily. Some little girls couldn't be so composed. Jenny Hood just screamed and shrieked after they carried her mother out. The Hoods are all such a feeling people. Emily was not reading. She was thinking. She knew the Murrays would be back in the afternoon, and she knew her fate would probably be settled then. We'll talk the matter over when we've come back, she had heard Uncle Wallace saying that morning after breakfast. Some instinct told her just what the matter was, and she would be given one of her pointed ear to hear the discussion, and she would have given one of her pointed ears to hear the discussion with the other. But she knew very well she would be sent out of the way, so she was not surprised when Ellen came to her in the twilight and said, You'd better go upstairs, Emily. Your aunts and uncles are coming in here to talk over all the business. Can I help you get supper? Asked Emily, who thought that if she were going and coming around the kitchen, she might catch a word or two. No, you'd be more bother than help. March, now. Ellen waddled out to the kitchen without waiting to see if Emily marched. Emily got up reluctantly. How could she sleep tonight if she didn't know what was going to happen to her? And she felt quite sure she would not be told until morning, if then. Her eyes fell on the oblong table in the center of the room. Its cloth was of generous proportions, falling in heavy folds to the floor. There was a flash of black stockings across the rug, a sudden disturbance of drapery, and then silence. Emily on the floor under the table arranged her legs comfortably and sat triumphant. She would hear what was decided, and nobody would be any wiser. She had never been told that it was not considered strictly honorable to eavesdrop, no occasion for such instruction ever having arisen in her life with her father, and she considered that it was a bit of pure luck that she had thought of hiding under the table. She could even see dimly through the cloth. Her heart beat so loudly in her excitement that she was afraid they would hear it. There was no other sound save the soft, faraway singing of frogs through the rain that sounded through the open window. In they came, down they sat around the room. Emily held her breath, and for a few minutes nobody spoke, though Aunt Eva sighed long and heavily. And then Uncle Wallace cleared his throat and said, "Well, what's to be done with the child?" Nobody was in a hurry to answer. Emily thought they would never speak until finally Aunt Eva said with a whine, "She's such a difficult child. So odd. I can't understand her at all." "I think," said Aunt Laura, "that she has what one might call an artistic temperament." "She's a spoiled child," said Aunt Ruth, very decidedly. "There's work ahead to straighten out her manners, if you ask me." The little listener under the table turned her head and shot a scornful glance at Aunt Ruth through the tablecloth. "I think that your own manners have a slight curve." Emily did not dare even to murmur the words under her breath, but she shaped them with her mouth. This was of great relief and satisfaction. "I agree with you," said Aunt Eva, "and I, for one, do not feel equal to the task." Emily understood that this meant Uncle Wallace didn't mean to take her, and she rejoiced the threat. "The truth is," said Uncle Wallace, "Aunt Nancy ought to take her. She has more of this world's goods than any of us." "Aunt Nancy would never dream of taking her, and you know it well enough," said Uncle Oliver. "Besides, she's entirely too old to be bringing up a child. Her and that old witch Caroline, upon my soul, I don't believe either of them is human. I would like to take Emily, but I feel that I can hardly do it. I've a large enough family to provide for." "She'll not likely live long to bother anyone," said Aunt Elizabeth crisply. "She'll probably die of consumption, same as her father did." I won't, thought Emily. And she thought it was such a whim that she almost seemed as though she had proclaimed it. She forgot that she had wanted to die soon so that she could overtake father. She wanted to live now just to put the Murrays in them wrong. "I haven't any intention of dying. I'm going to live for ages and be a famous authoress. And you'll just see if I don't, Aunt Elizabeth Murray." "She is a weedy-looking child," acknowledged Uncle Wallace. Emily relieved her outraged feelings by making a face at Uncle Wallace through the tablecloth. "If I ever possess a pig, I'm going to name it after you," she thought. And then she felt quite satisfied with that revenge. "Somebody has to look after her as long as she's alive, though, you know," said Uncle Oliver. "Oh, it would serve you all right if I did die and you suffered terrible remorse for the rest of your lives," Emily thought. Then in the pause that happened to follow, she dramatically pictured out her funeral, selected her pallbearers, and tried to choose the hymn verse that she wanted engraved on her tombstone. But before she could settle this, Uncle Wallace began again. "Well, we're not getting anywhere. We have to look after the child." "I wish you wouldn't call me the child," thought Emily. "And some of us must give her a home. Juliet's daughter must not be left to the mercy of strangers. Personally, I feel that Eva's health is not equal to the care of raising a child." "Of such a child," said Aunt Eva. Emily stuck out her tongue at Aunt Eva. "Poor little soul," said Aunt Laura gently. Something frozen in Emily's heart melted at that moment. She was pitifully pleased at being called poor little soul so tenderly. "I do not think you need to pity her overmuch, Laura," said Uncle Wallace decidedly. "It's evident that she has very little feeling. I have not seen her shed a tear since we came here." "Notice she would not even take a last look at her father," said Aunt Elizabeth. Cousin Jimmy suddenly whistled at the ceiling. "She feels so much that she has to hide it," said Aunt Laura. Aunt Elizabeth stirred restlessly. "I don't suppose she'd be contented at New Moon with 3 old people like us." I would, thought Emily. "Ruth, what about you?" said Uncle Wallace. "You're all alone in that big house. It would be a good thing for you to have some company." "I don't like her," said Ruth sharply. "She's as sly as a snake." "I'm not," thought Emily. "With wise and careful training, many of her faults may be cured," said Uncle Wallace. "I don't want them cured." Emily was getting angrier and angrier all the time under the table. "I like my faults better than I do your, she fumbled mentally for a word and then triumphantly recalled a phrase of her father's. "Your abominable virtues." "I doubt it," said Aunt Ruth in a biting tone. "What's bred in the bones comes out in the flesh, and as for Douglas Starr, I think it was perfectly disgraceful for him to die and leave that child without a cent." "Did he do it on purpose?" asked Cousin Jimmy. It was the first time he had spoken. He was a miserable failure, snapped Aunt Ruth. He wasn't. He wasn't, screamed Emily, suddenly sticking her head out under the tablecloth, between the end legs of the table. For a moment, the Murrays sat as silent and motionless as if the outburst had turned them to stone, and then Aunt Ruth rose, stalked to the table, and lifted the cloth, behind which Emily had retired in dismay, realizing what she'd done. "Get up and come out of there, Emily Starr," said Aunt Ruth. Emily Starr got up and came out. She was not specifically frightened. She was too angry to be that. Her eyes had gone black and her cheeks crimson. What a little beauty. What a regular little beauty, said Cousin Jimmy, but nobody heard him. Aunt Ruth had the floor. "You shameless little eavesdropper," she said. "There's the Starr blood coming out. A Murray would never have done such a thing. You ought to be whipped." "Father wasn't a failure," cried Emily. "You had no right to call him a failure. Nobody who was loved as much as he could be a failure, and I don't believe anybody's ever loved you, so it's you that's the failure, and I'm not going to die of consumption." "Do you realize what a shameful thing you've been guilty of?" demanded Aunt Ruth. "I wanted to hear what was going to become of me," cried Emily, "and I didn't know it was such a dreadful thing to do. I didn't know you were going to say such horrible things about me." "Listeners never hear any good of themselves," said Aunt Elizabeth impressively. "Your mother would never have done that, Emily." The bravado all went out of poor Emily. She felt guilty and miserable. Oh, so miserable she hadn't known, but it seemed she had committed a terrible sin. "Go upstairs," said Aunt Ruth. Emily went without a protest. But before going, she looked around the room. While I was under the table, she said, I made a face at Uncle Wallace and stuck my tongue out at Aunt Eva. She said it sorrowfully, desiring to make a clean breast of her transgressions, but so easily do we misunderstand each other that the Murrays actually thought she was indulging in a piece of gratuitous impertinence. When the door had closed behind her, they all, except Aunt Laura and Cousin Jimmy, shook their heads and groaned. Emily went upstairs in a state of bitter humiliation. She felt that she had done something that gave the Murrays the right to despise her, and they thought it was the star coming out in her. And she had not even found out what her fate was to be. She looked dismally at little Emily in the glass. I didn't know, she whispered. But I'll know after this, she added with a sudden vim, and I'll never, ever do it again. For a moment she thought she would throw herself on her bed and cry. She couldn't bear all the pain and shame that were burning in her heart. When her eyes fell on the old yellow account book on her little table, a minute later Emily was curled up on her bed, tusk fashion, writing eagerly in the old book with her little stubby lead pencil. As her fingers flew over the faded lines, her cheeks flushed and her eyes shone. She forgot the Murrays, although she was writing about them. She forgot her humiliation, although she was describing what had happened. And for an hour she wrote steadily by the wretched light of the smoky little lamp, never pausing, save now and then to gaze out of the window into the dim beauty of the misty night, while she hunted through her consciousness for a certain word she wanted, and when she found it she gave a happy sigh and fell to again. When she heard the Murrays coming upstairs, she put her book away. She had finished. She had written a description of the whole occurrence, and she had wound up with a pathetic description of her own deathbed, with the Murrays standing around imploring her forgiveness. At first she depicted Aunt Ruth as doing it on her knees in an agony of remorseful sobs. And then she suspended her pencil. Aunt Ruth couldn't ever feel as bad as that over anything, she thought. And she drew her pencil through the line. In the writing, pain and humiliation had passed away, and she only felt tired and rather happy. It had been fun, finding words to fit Uncle Wallace, and what exquisite satisfaction it had been to describe Aunt Ruth as a dumpy little woman. I wonder what my uncles and aunts would say if they knew what I really think of them, she murmured as she got into bed. And that's Chapter 4. Chapter 5, Diamond Cut Diamond. Emily, who had been pointedly ignored by the Murrays at breakfast, was called into the parlor when the meal was over. They were all there, the whole flannex of them, and it occurred to Emily as she looked at Uncle Wallace sitting in the spring sunshine that she had not just found the exact word, after all, to express his peculiar quality of grimness. Aunt Elizabeth stood unsmilingly by the table with the slips of paper in her hand. Emily, she said, last night we could not decide who should take you. I may say that none of us feel very much like doing so, for you have behaved very badly in many respects." "Oh, Elizabeth," protested Laura, she's her sister's child." Elizabeth lifted a hand regally. "I am doing this, Laura. Have the goodness not to interrupt me. As I was saying, Emily, we could not decide as to who should have the care of you, so we have agreed to Cousin Jimmy's suggestion that we settle the matter by lot. I have our names here written on these slips of paper. You will draw one, and the one whose name is on it will give you a home." Aunt Elizabeth held out the slips of paper. Emily trembled so violently that at first she couldn't draw one. This was terrible. It seemed as if she must blindly settle her own fate. "Draw," said Aunt Elizabeth. Emily set her teeth, threw back her head with the air of one who challenges destiny, and drew. Aunt Elizabeth took the slip from the little shaking hand and held it up. On it was her own name, Elizabeth Murray. Laura Murray suddenly put her handkerchief to her eyes. "Well, that's settled," said Uncle Wallace, getting up with an air of relief. "And if I'm going to catch that train, I've got to hurry. Of course, as far as the matter of expenses goes, Elizabeth, I'll do my share." "We're not paupers at New Moon," said Aunt Elizabeth rather coldly. "Since it has fallen to me to take her, I shall do all that is necessary, Wallace. I do not shirk my duty." "I'm her duty," thought Emily. "Father said nobody ever liked a duty, so Aunt Elizabeth will never like me." "You've got more of the Murray pride than all the rest of us put together, Elizabeth," laughed Uncle Wallace. They all followed him out, all except Aunt Laura. She came up to Emily, standing alone in the middle of the room, and drew her into her arms. "I'm so glad, Emily, I'm so glad," she whispered. "Don't fret, dear child. I love you already, and New Moon is a nice place." "It has a pretty name," said Emily, struggling for self-control. I've always hoped I could go with you." "Aunt Laura, I think I'm going to cry, but it's not because I'm sorry I'm going there. My manners are not as bad as you may think, Aunt Laura, and I wouldn't have listened last night if I'd known it was wrong." "Of course you wouldn't have," said Aunt Laura. "But I'm not a Murray, you know." Then Aunt Laura said a queer thing for a Murray. "Thank heavens for that," said Aunt Laura. Cousin Jimmy followed Emily out and overtook her in the little hall. Looking carefully around to ensure privacy, he whispered, "Your Aunt Laura is a great hand at making an apple turnover." Emily thought apple turnover sounded nice, though she didn't know what it was. She whispered back in a question which she would never dare to Aunt Elizabeth or even Aunt Laura. "Cousin Jimmy, when they make a cake at New Moon, will they let me scrape out the mixing bowl and eat the scrapings?" "Laura will. Elizabeth won't," Cousin Jimmy whispered solemnly. "And put my feet in the oven when they get cold and have a cookie before I go to bed." "Answer same as before," said Cousin Jimmy. "I'll recite my poetry to you. It's very few people I do that for. I've composed 1,000 poems. They're not written down. I carry them." Cousin Jimmy tapped his forehead. "Is it very hard to write poetry?" whispered Emily, looking with new respect at Cousin Jimmy. "Easy as rolling a log if you can find enough rhythms," said Cousin Jimmy. They all went away that morning except the New Moon people. Aunt Elizabeth announced that they would stay until the next day to pack up and take Emily with them. "Most of the furniture belongs to the house," she said, "so it won't take long to get ready. There are only Douglas Starr's books and a few of his personal belongings to pack." "How shall I carry my cats?" asked Emily. Aunt Elizabeth stared at her. "Cats? You'll take no cats." "Oh, but I must take Mike and Saucy Sal," said Emily. "I can't leave them behind. I can't live without a cat." "Nonsense. There are barn cats at New Moon, and they're never allowed in the house." "Don't you like cats?" "Oh, no, I do not." "Don't you like the feel of a nice soft cat?" persisted Emily. "No, I would as soon touch a snake." "There's a lovely old wax doll of your mother's up here," said Aunt Laura. "I'll dress it up for you." "I don't like dolls. They can't talk," exclaimed Emily. "Neither can cats." "Oh, can't they? Mike and Saucy Sal can. I must take them, please, Aunt Elizabeth. I love those cats, and they're the only things left in the world that love me, please." "What's a cat more or less on 200 acres, said Cousin Jimmy. "Take 'em along, Elizabeth." Aunt Elizabeth considered this for a moment. Aunt Elizabeth considered for a moment. She couldn't understand why anybody should want a cat. Aunt Elizabeth was one of those people who never do understand anything unless it's told to them in plain language and hammered into their heads, and then they understand it, if only with their brains, but not with their hearts. "You may take one of the cats," she said at last, with the air of a person making a great concession. "One, and no more, and do not argue. You may as well learn first as last, Emily, that when I say a thing, I mean it. And that's enough, Jimmy." Cousin Jimmy bit off something he had tried to say, stuck his hands in his pockets, and whistled at the ceiling. "When she won't, she won't. We're all born with that kink in us, and you'll have to put up with it. More by token that you're full of it yourself, you know. Talk about your not being a Murray. The star is the only skin deep with you." "It isn't. I'm all star. I want to be," cried Emily. "And oh, how can I choose between Mike and Saucy Sal?" This was indeed a problem. Emily wrestled with it all day, her heart bursting. She liked Mike the best. There was no doubt of that, but she couldn't leave Saucy Sal to Emily's tender mercies. To Ellen's tender mercies. Ellen had always hated Sal, but she rather liked Mike, and she would be good to him. Emily was going back to her own little house in Maywood Village, and she wanted a cat, at least in the evening, so Emily made her bitter decision. She would take Saucy Sal. "Better take the Tom," said Cousin Jimmy. "Not so much bother with kittens, you know, Emily." "Jimmy," said Aunt Elizabeth sternly. Emily wondered over the sternness. Why were kittens to be spoken of? But she didn't like to hear Mike called the Tom. It sounded insulting. And she didn't like the bustle of commotion of packing up. She longed for the old quiet of the sweet remembered talks with her father. She felt as if she had been thrust far away from her by this influx of Murrays. "What's this?" said Aunt Elizabeth, suddenly pausing for a moment in her packing. Emily looked up and saw with dismay that Aunt Elizabeth had in her hands the old account book. That she was opening it. That she was reading in it. Emily sprang across the floor and snatched the book. "You mustn't read that, Aunt Elizabeth. That's mine, and it's my private property." "Hoity-toity, Miss Starr," said Aunt Elizabeth, staring at her. "Let me tell you that I have a right to read your books. I'm responsible for you now, and I'm not going to have anything hidden or underhanded. You understand that? You have evidently something here that you are ashamed to have seen, and I mean to see it. Give me that book." "Oh, I'm not ashamed of it," cried Emily. "But I won't let you or anybody see it." Aunt Elizabeth followed. "Emily Starr, do you hear what I say? Give me that book at once." No. Emily turned and ran. She would never let Aunt Elizabeth see that book. She fled to the kitchen stove. She whisked off a cover and she crammed the book into the glowing fire. It caught and blazed merrily. Emily watched it in agony. It seemed as if a part of herself were burning in there, but Aunt Elizabeth should never see it. See all the little things she had written and read to Father, all her fancies about the Wind Woman and Emily in the glass, all her little cat dialogues, all the things she had said in it last night about the Murrays. She watched the leaves shrivel and shudder as if they were sentient things and then turn black. A line of white writing came out vividly on one. "Aunt Elizabeth is very cold and haughty." "Aunt Elizabeth is cold and haughty, and she is not fair." Next morning, while Cousin Jimmy was tying the boxes at the back of the double-seated buggy, and Aunt Elizabeth was giving Ellen her final instructions, Emily said goodbye to everything. To the rooster pine and Adam and Eve. "They'll miss me so when I'm gone. There won't be anyone here to love them," she said wistfully. To the spider crack in the kitchen window, to the old wing chair, to the bed of striped glass, to the silver birch lady. She went upstairs to the window of her old room. The little window had always seemed to Emily to open on a world of wonder. In the burned account book there had been one piece of which she was especially proud. A description of the view from my window. She had sat there and dreamed at night. She used to kneel there and say her little prayers. Sometimes the stars shone through it. Sometimes the rain beat against it. Sometimes the little gray birds and swallows visited it. Sometimes airy fragrances floated in from the apple and lilac blossom. Sometimes the Wind Woman laughed and sighed and sang and whistled round it. Emily had heard her there in the dark nights in the wild winter storms. She did not say goodbye to the Wind Woman, for she knew the Wind Woman would be at new moon too, but she said goodbye to the little window and the green hill she had loved. and to her fairy-haunted barrens, and to the little Emily in the glass. There might be another Emily in the glass at new moon, but she wouldn't be the same one. And she unpinned from the wall and stowed away in her pocket the picture of the ball dress she had cut from a fashion sheet. It was such a wonderful dress, all white lace and wreaths and rosebuds, with a long, long train of lace flounces that must reach clear across the room. Emily had pictured herself 1,000 times wearing that dress, sweeping a queen of beauty across a ballroom floor. Downstairs they were waiting for her. Emily said goodbye to Ellen Green rather indifferently. She had never liked Ellen Green at any time, and since the night Ellen had told her father, and ever since the night Ellen had told her her father was going to die, she had hated and feared her. Ellen, amazed by Emily bursting into tears and hugging her, begging her not to forget her, asking her to write her, calling her my blessed child. I'm not your blessed child, said Emily, but I will write to you, and will you be very good to Mike? I believe you feel worse over leaving that cat than you do over leaving me, sniffed Ellen. Why, of course I do, said Emily, amazed that there could be any question about it. It took all of her resolution not to cry when she bade farewell to Mike, who was curled up in the sun-warm grass at the back door. Maybe I'll see you again sometime, she whispered as she hugged him. I'm sure good cats go to heaven. And then they were off in the double-seated buggy with its fringed canopy, always affected by the Murrays of New Moon. Emily had never driven in anything so splendid before. She had never even had many drives. Once or twice her father had borrowed Mr. Hubbard's old buckboard and gray pony to drive to Charlottetown. The buckboard was ratty and the pony slow, but father had talked her into it all the way and made the road a wonder. Cousin Jimmy and Aunt Elizabeth sat in the front, the latter very imposing in black lace bonnet and mantle, and Laura and Emily occupied the seat behind, with saucy Sal between them in the basket, shrieking piously. Emily glanced back as they drove up the grassy lane and thought of the little old brown house in the hollow that had a broken-hearted look. She longed to run back and comfort it. In spite of her resolution, the tears came into her eyes, but Aunt Laura put a kid-glove hand across Sal's basket and caught Emily's in a close, understanding squeeze. Oh, I just love you, Aunt Laura, whispered Emily. And Aunt Laura's eyes were very, very blue, very deep, and very kind. And that, my friends, is chapter 5. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you on Monday with another vlog. Bye, guys.